Hello there and welcome back for another edition of Not Your Average Globetrotter. I'm Rafael de Furia, back at it again. For this Friday night episode, I wanted to first say, though, a huge thank you to everybody who left a comment or reached out privately for all of the well wishes and just making sure that I'm okay. And even there were some of you that reached out to me personally to make sure that everything was taken care of. And really thank you all so very much for being with me during this past week. It's been rough. I'm not going to mention exactly what happened in this episode, but it's something YouTube that they sometimes ding you for. So thankfully I'm doing a lot better now, not sick anymore, but definitely there's going to be a recovery period where we'll need some time to get back to normal. But I'm definitely fine for now. So we are here because nothing can hold me back from this week's episode. And this week, I kind of wanted to address two different comments that have been left by two different people talking kind of about not necessarily the same subject, but something that I think very much relates to one another. From RP Miller, hi Rafi, just curious, other than beloved gelato, what do you miss about living in Italy? And then from Janet L, both actually on the same episode 247, living in Portugal 6 months after moving to Portugal, kind of what I've learned and experienced so far. And Janet left a comment saying, hi Rafael, what's your preference, Portugal or Italy? Thank you. And I know there was one other person, I couldn't find the comment, but it was along those same lines of, what do I prefer, Portugal or Italy? And I just have to start out this episode by saying that I love each of these countries, and I'm grateful for the experiences that I've had in both and to be able to get to know these places. And I can say that it's not that I like one more than the other, it's that each of them has their own things where it comes out ahead of the other country. In this episode, I want to compare a number of different factors. Some of them I've touched on before, but there are a lot of things that I think are worthwhile taking into account when thinking about if you're comparing and contrasting these two countries, because as I've found out since moving here, there are a number of you guys that are actually comparing and contrasting and deciding which one may be right for you. But before we get into the rest of this episode, a huge thank you to those of you who helped to keep this project going through the one-time donations, through the thanks button now here on YouTube, or through rafaeldefuria.com/support, or through rafaeldefuria.com/Patreon for the monthly donations. Thank you all so much for helping this project to be able to continue, for allowing me to be able to consider moving forward with this project, as well as a huge thank you to those of you who share these episodes with your friends and family and have also given these videos likes. They all very much help out the channel. But I do think it's about time to get into this episode, comparing and contrasting, talking a little bit more about some of my opinions between Portugal and Italy. So roll that intro. One thing in particular that I really do miss about being in Italy is having easy access to some of these really iconic places, like especially, for example, Venice. Some of you know I have very mixed emotions when it comes to the city. Like I in one way I really love it, but in the other way it's just such a tourist trap that I'm not a fan of. But my memories of being there when it was almost empty, that's just something that will always stand out in my mind as this magical moment, this magical period. Even though things were horrible, it was so wonderful to get to experience. And where I lived before in Italy, in the at least the place I lived before moving to Portugal, in Rovigo, I really was so grateful that I had the high-speed line so close by that I felt like it, just jump on a train and I'm there pretty quickly. Even if it was just a regional train, it was great. It was so amazing to be able to have that at my fingertips, or even to roam from my door to the center of the city in about 3 hours. I mean, that's kind of unbelievable. Or even say if I wanted to go to Switzerland or Germany or even Milan, we're talking about maybe like 5 hours here, depending on where exactly. But even I do have to say, though, comparing it to living here now, that if I wanted to go to Switzerland, Germany, Milan, it almost might take me the same amount of time, because living in Portugal, yeah, it's a little bit further away as far as distance goes. But if you're taking a plane, there are some really cheap flights. And I will say, comparing the cost of travel and the cost of getting around, that's something I want to get into a little bit more later on in this episode. But let's just compare, for example, the distance between where I live now in Braga to Porto versus Rovigo to Venezia. They're not necessarily the same exact distance, but the trips there are roughly the same. And I can say, like from Braga to Porto, for example, a round trip ticket would cost me roughly the same as it would for a one-way ticket to Venice. I mean, that's one thing that I can say that Portugal really does have a leg up on the game, so to speak, when it comes to transportation and getting around. But Italy is a much larger country, so you'll be traveling a lot longer before you hit a different border. But you also do have a lot of countries very close, and of course, with trains and so on, and planes and even boats, you can get to different places pretty easily. In Portugal, you're kind of at the end of Europe. So realistically speaking, when we're talking about countries that are easy to drive to, we're mostly talking about Spain, theoretically, Andorra or Gibraltar. But I mean, these are places that are not necessarily like around the corner per se, but they're also not that far away either. But even from Braga itself, where I live right now, to get to a city called Vigo in Spain, just north of Portugal, it's like an hour and a half away by car, or even, I think as well, by bus. So you do have options to get into different places. So it's not like, oh, being at the end of Europe means that there's nothing, there's nowhere. There is plenty to explore. But I will say that there is something special about Italy and some of the locations, the iconic locations that so many people think about when it comes to especially architecture and cities. Portugal has some very beautiful places, but they're not necessarily the same places that people first think of when they're thinking about these big trips that they're planning around Europe. Italy, of course, is one of these places that people have known about for so long. Portugal is just starting to get onto people's radar, though. But before I get back into transportation and kind of the cost of living in each of these places, I do, of course, want to talk a little bit about food. One of my favorite things in both of these countries. And I will say, overall, I know this is about to be some heresy that I'm dropping here, but overall, when it comes to the meal, the main part of your meal, I do have a preference for Portuguese dishes. The reason being is that there always seems to be protein as a focal point within the meal. Whereas in Italy, I can say there have been many restaurants that I've been to and culinary experiences that I've had there, where the main part of the meal feels like it revolves around a starch. I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but don't get me wrong. I do love both styles of cuisine, and since coming here to Portugal, I have sought out some Italian-style dishes. It's not been the easiest to find because there are a lot of things that are with a Portuguese flair or maybe somewhat in the direction of Italian-American, not quite Portuguese, not quite Italian, like somewhere kind of mashed up around somewhere around the Atlantic Ocean. But it's been really fun to be able to have some of those things here. I mean, I know when it comes time to Christmas, I'm going to really be missing some good, like high quality panettone, but you can actually get them here, like supermarket quality, not the same ones that I would get in Italy. Because like even Italy, you go to the supermarket, you get some really, really good stuff. But I know that's something that's just not going to be the same. But when it comes to desserts, I do happen to like how Italy has very subdued, not overly sweet flavors. That's something that so far for me in Portugal has been a little bit tricky. Especially when it comes to ice creams. Some of you know that so far I'm not all that impressed. I do feel something lacking. I mean, once you start up at the top of the mountain, it's hard to take some steps back down. But I do really enjoy the different selection of cakes and cookies that are made here. I really, really like the Portuguese pastries. This is something that I can definitely say I have enjoyed quite a bit since being in this country. One thing in particular, though, when it comes to sweet things is how common it is to find dulce de leite, or something that I guess in Italian would be dolce di latte, or in Spanish, dulce de leche. Maybe you know it like that. Kind of like caramel, but not the same. It's same, but different. And so I really enjoy how many things that you can find. It's not everywhere. It's not all dessert menus here will have it, but it's not uncommon to find. And as somebody who really enjoys that, I've been very happy with that here in Portugal. But overall, when it comes to the food that you can find here, I will say though that in both countries, I have had issues finding, I guess what you could call ethnic cuisine kind of from other parts of the world. However, Portugal maybe does have another little leg up here just because of the connections to the colonies that Portugal once had. You can find some foods from those places here that are actually pretty good. Like you can find Brazilian food here that is not Brazilian, like totally Brazilian, but very authentic, made by Brazilians, just some slightly different ingredients because of what they can get here. I know there are some Angolan places. I haven't really gotten into that so much, but you can find these things here that are really, really amazing. Italy doesn't have that there was a colony, but it's not like so much that there was a cultural influence back and forth, whereas Portugal definitely had some influence back and forth that the colonies influenced Portugal influenced the colonies. I mean, this is a long history lesson for another episode. I mean, even a former Portuguese colony actually controlled Portugal at one point. The royalty were based in another country and they ruled over Portugal from abroad. Like I said, different episode for a different day. But getting back to the cost of living, in my opinion, overall, very similar. Very, very similar. I wouldn't say that there's like this huge difference, disparity, whatever the word is, that would really make it that, if you can only afford to live in this place or you can only afford to that place. But maybe if we're talking about the cities, maybe the Portuguese cities might be a little bit less, but we're really not talking about by a lot here. But generally speaking, food here and a lot of daily things are going to be a little lower cost. But when you start factoring in everything else, I would say overall very similar footing. There are going to be parts of the country where you can find things that are dirt cheap. And then there are going to be other parts of the country where things are a little bit more pricey. But like I was saying before, the transportation costs domestically here in Portugal seems to be a lot less. Like I said, about like for the similar distance of travel between Braga and Porto and Rovigo and Venezia, about half of the price. But let's also consider a private transfer from the city to the airport or vice versa. In Italy, when I moved here, I needed to get a private van because I had a ton of luggage with me, other people. And so we decided, okay, just easier to split a van rather than have to take trains and carrying everything. And it was going to be a nightmare. So again, we're talking about from Rovigo to the airport or Braga to the airport, very similar distance here. But in Italy, the price that I paid through a local connection was 250 euros. 3 people, ton of suitcases. So that was pretty expensive. And that was actually more than even the price of the ticket for flying over to Portugal. But in Portugal, the similar distance for a van, actually that was even bigger than the one in Italy, was 50. So literally 5 times the price. Or again, like even if we're talking about taxis, Ubers, whatever, Rovigo didn't really have Ubers, but we're talking about sometimes maybe double the price for an even shorter distance than what you might have here. I mean, like I've mentioned in previous episodes, I've been absolutely shocked sometimes at how low the prices can be here, even in a normal taxi. But one thing that's really important to consider is not necessarily price of your apartments. Again, like my experience has been very similar pricing, but availability. In Italy, you have so much more available for rental properties as well as properties for sale. Of course, it depends on where you are, what you're looking for, what you're needing. But what I've seen in Portugal, because it is so much of a smaller country and it's becoming a hot spot, there's a lot going on, that if you do find a place, especially like one of the cities that are more desirable, that the apartments for rentals go very quickly. So if you are searching online and you find something that you like, even without seeing it, I personally might hop on it. And that's actually what I did. There was one place I was kind of into it. It was fine. It would have met my needs, but there was some things wasn't exactly what I was looking for. And by the time I came back to the agent, he said, "Oh yeah, sorry, no, just signed earlier." And I've heard that from other people as well, that when you find something, you really need to hop on it. So there was another place that was available. The price had come down a bit, and I was working with a guy that actually took me on a like WhatsApp call through this apartment so that I could see it and kind of have an idea, because I was working with one agent that worked with another agent for this apartment, 2 different agencies. So whatever, my guy I had been working with already. And then also I found the apartment myself. So like I felt as though I could trust the situation a little bit more. But yeah, I had to get that done before getting here. But for some of you who don't have a European citizenship and are going through the process for the D7, where you do actually need an apartment for the legal process to get here, this is something that you really need to consider, that if you find something that meets all of your needs and it looks great and it seems great and it seems like the right place, but maybe you want to think about things, don't. Take it immediately. Like, don't even sleep on it. Especially in Braga. In other places, things don't move as fast, but it's still pretty quick here. But of course, if you're buying, the situation is very different. So I'm going to leave that for another episode in the future, because so far, of course, my experience is through renting. But kind of bringing it back to the whole D7 thing. Personally, I didn't have to go through that. Like I mentioned in previous episodes, I'm an Italian citizen, so I am able to be here and just kind of show up and just live. It's definitely an oversimplification of the process and everything that needs to be done, but it's much more simple than the process for other people that are coming from outside of the European Union. But when we're comparing Italy to Portugal, Portugal definitely is going to be the easier of the two for people who don't have European citizenship already. But also, it's going to be one of the easiest countries in the European Union overall for you to be able to get citizenship. But the funny thing is, even as an Italian citizen moving to Portugal, it kind of felt like an easier process to move here, because also in Italy, you have a police check that has to be done for residency. As I've mentioned in previous episodes, residency is a very different concept in a lot of Europe than it is in the States. And you have to register yourself. You have to go to the municipal offices, the city hall, and say, "Hey, I'm here living at such and such place at such and such address," and blah, blah, blah. And in Italy, part of that process includes a random police check to come and actually see that you're at the place where you say you are. In Portugal, there's no such thing, as far as I'm aware. I asked many people and they said, "What? You have to wait for the police to come? What? No, we don't do that." So I'll say I'm pretty darn sure it's not part of the process here. But let's talk also about something that's also really important: the public medical system. Your access to the public medical system will depend on how you're here and if you can, or if you have to do private or whatever. But as an Italian citizen, I have had access to both of these systems. As an Italian citizen living in Italy, I can get it automatically. And in Portugal, somewhat automatically as well. In both cases, you have to go and register. But what I will say is that also, I have only had the experience of going to the hospital in Italy and dealing with emergency services there, thankfully. But I personally would say that I did have a positive experience. Am I going to say that everything was easy and that everything was like perfect? Not necessarily, especially if you don't have the language. I really do think that you do have to have the language there. I did get lucky in one situation where I did have a doctor who did speak English. Just even though I could speak the language, sometimes clarifications and understanding technical things, it's easier in your own language. But what I will say is that's what's really cool for the Portuguese public system is that you can call them up on the phone and they actually have an option for an English speaking operator. And when I went through this bout recently of everything that I went through, I actually got on the phone with them. I said, hey, these are my symptoms. This is what's going on. They said, okay, you have to stay home X amount of days and don't worry, you're going to be fine. And even the person that I spoke to was like really friendly. Oh, I'm so sorry that you're feeling that way. Oh, that's horrible. I hope you feel better soon and blah, 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 blah. I can't say that I necessarily had that type of like bedside manner in Italy, but maybe it was because this person was on the phone. But I will say that in general, that the Portuguese can be very warm and very friendly. The Italians can also be, but I would say maybe in Portugal, the warmth, you feel it a little bit more and a little bit more quickly. That was just my experience. I'm not saying that that's 100% true, just how I've experienced these things so far. And dealing with the Portuguese national system on the phone was really easy because like I was feeling like crap. I didn't have to go to a hospital. I didn't have to this. I didn't have to that. The woman said, hey, because also waiting on the phone can take a bit of time, said, oh, by the way, just so you know, if in the future you have anything that's going on, you can go to the hospital because they realize that the phone line can take a little bit of time. But to not have to go out was really a big deal, especially with how I was feeling. But also on top of everything, a couple hours later by SMS, I ended up getting a referral or prescription to go get a test. I could have either chosen to go do it at a pharmacy or at a laboratory, and it was going to be covered by the local system. Like it was going to be nothing out of pocket for this test. They said, hey, do you already have this number and that number? Because what we can do is we can get the process started for you if you're going to be missing work so that you don't have to worry about compensation, so that you can actually get sick days off from work. So they were really helpful to try and get all these things going, but I didn't want to take out of the system. So I was like, hey, look, I appreciate it, but from like a moral and kind of ethical standpoint, I don't want to take out of the system, like not at this point in time. So I didn't pursue that. I could have, that was an option available to me. But even when I was in Italy, like I said, I had really positive experiences. And even though the bedside manner maybe wasn't as friendly, they were still very helpful, very kind, very much making sure that everything was all right. So can I say that one is better than the other? Not necessarily, because I haven't had that experience here in Portugal. But what I can say also is that from everything that I've heard so far, I haven't been able to confirm this, but from everything that I've been able to gather, it seems as though the Portuguese private system costs a lot less than the Italian private system. So if you're going to have to come here and pay out of pocket for yourself, or pay for it, not necessarily out of pocket, but pay for health insurance on your own, that's something to keep in mind, because as a non-European, you may not be able to get onto the public system unless you have some type of European citizenship. Not all European citizenships will be able to get you onto a public system, because it all depends on if people from that country can get it in your country, if it's the reciprocity and all of this and that and the other. But, for example, being an Italian citizen, I'm able to get on the system. And I can say even for the test that I had to get for the nose swab, I would say doing it here was, because I had to actually do it before coming to Portugal, because just right before I arrived here, they changed the rules that everybody then had to get a test. It wasn't just people who had or didn't have the poke, let's just call it that, but everybody needed the test to be able to get into the country. So I had to scramble around and make sure that I could get the test done and organize it for the right time and the right place and this and that. But for the place that I ended up doing, they had a hotline, and there was someone on the line that spoke English. So it was really easy. I had the appointment for the next day after I got this referral. And again, I got that by SMS, took care of this very, very easily. I'm not going to say it was difficult to do in Italy, but out of two places that were really, really easy to get this done, Portugal was the easier of the two. So you have to consider this as somebody who may not be a native speaker of the language. Maybe overall, Portugal might be a little bit more friendly for you during your transitional period. Like I've said in previous episodes, I can get around in Portuguese. I have enough to be able to communicate. In some ways, maybe a little bit better than my Italian, depending on the subject. But overall, can I say, oh, do I think one country is so much better than the other? No. they're just two completely different places, both that are completely amazing and both that I really enjoyed and that I'm so grateful that I get to experience. But I think this is where I'm going to end off this episode. So of course, again, a huge thank you to those of you who helped to make these episodes possible, to rafaeldefuria.com/Patreon, patreon.com/rafaeldefuria, as well as now the thanks button here on YouTube. Thank you all so very much, as well as the one-time donations. Thank you all so very much for being a part of this and helping me to be able to continue this project, as well as a big thank you to those of you who've been liking and sharing and subscribing and helping in that way for this project to be able to continue. They all really do help, so truly, thank you all so very much. But of course, as always, I'm Rafael de Furia. I am so grateful to be back. Thank you all for sticking around, and again for your patience for last week for not being able to upload an episode. Stay safe and healthy out there. Really, stay healthy. And yeah, I'll see you all next time. Later.